My sister, I know what it feels like to walk alone, to feel like no one understands you, like no one truly sees the depth of who you are. You look around and there's no one to call, no one to lean on. But hear me today. You are not alone. The world may look at you and say, she has no friends, but God says, she has me. And when you have God, you have more than enough. God separates to elevate. Sometimes isolation is not rejection, it is redirection. God pulls you away to protect you. He removes distractions so he can pour into you. In the Bible, Joseph was thrown into a pit by his own brothers, left alone, abandoned. But in that solitude, God was preparing him for the palace. So if you feel like you have no friends, don't curse the silence, bless it. God is making you strong, unshakable, and ready for the next level. You are set apart, not left out. The world loves crowds, but God chooses a remnant. He handpicks the few. Not everyone is meant to walk with you. Jesus himself walked with 12, but in the most critical moments, he separated even from them to be alone with God. Sister, you are not left out. You are set apart. You were not created to blend in. You were created to stand out. You were made to carry a divine assignment that others may not understand. God is your best friend. Psalm 68:6 says, God sets the lonely in family. If you feel like you have no friends, remember this. You have a Father, you have a King, and you have a Comforter. The Holy Spirit is your companion. He whispers wisdom when you're confused. He holds you up when you feel weak. Let the world misunderstand you. Let people walk away. Let them question why you're different. Because in the end, it is God's approval that matters, not man's validation. Walk boldly, woman of God. You are never alone. You are chosen. You are loved. You are covered. Now rise up and walk in the power of your calling. God separates to elevate. This is a truth many struggle to understand because separation often feels like rejection. When people walk away, when doors close, when friendships fade, it's easy to think something is wrong with us. But what if I told you that your loneliness is not a curse, but a calling? What if I told you that your isolation is not a punishment, but preparation? God never removes without reason. He never separates without purpose. When he pulls you away, it is because he is getting ready to take you higher. Look at the story of Joseph. He had dreams of greatness, but before he could step into that destiny, he had to be separated. His own brothers betrayed him, threw him into a pit, and sold him into slavery. He went from being surrounded by family to being completely alone in a foreign land. But what seemed like abandonment was actually alignment. God was positioning Joseph, not punishing him. If Joseph had stayed comfortable in his father's house, he never would have made it to the palace. His separation was necessary for his elevation. Some of you are wondering why people have left your life. You had friends you trusted, people you thought would be there forever, but now they are gone. You feel forgotten, overlooked, and unimportant. But let me tell you this, God removes people who cannot go where He is taking you. Not everyone is meant to walk with you into your destiny. Some people are seasonal, and when their time is up, God allows the separation to happen. It may hurt, but it is necessary. Moses was raised in Pharaoh's palace, surrounded by wealth and power, but before he could lead the Israelites to freedom, he had to be separated. He fled into the wilderness away from everything familiar and spent years alone tending sheep. That isolation wasn't wasted. God was preparing him. He was building his character, his faith, and his strength. When the time was right, God called him back, not as a prince of Egypt, but as a deliverer of God's people. Many times, God will pull you into a wilderness season to teach you things you could never learn in comfort. He separates you from distractions so you can hear His voice clearly. He removes relationships that are keeping you stagnant because He wants to take you higher. The problem is, we often resist this process. We beg God to bring people back, to reopen closed doors, to restore what He has removed. But if God closed that door, trust that it was for a reason. If God ended that friendship, believe that He saw something you couldn't see. Separation is not rejection, it is redirection. God is shifting you, aligning you, and molding you into the person He created you to be. He is stripping away what is unnecessary so he can fill you with what is eternal. When you feel alone, don't run to distractions. Don't try to force relationships that God has already removed. Instead, press into his presence. Let him refine you. Let him strengthen you. Look at Jesus. He had disciples, followers, and crowds surrounding him, but when it was time for the cross, he stood alone. Even his closest friends abandoned him. Yet in that separation, the greatest elevation took place. He fulfilled his purpose, defeated death, and rose in victory. If Jesus had to walk through a season of separation before elevation, why do we think we will be any different? You may feel lonely now, but loneliness is often the birthplace of purpose. It is in the quiet that God speaks the loudest. It is in isolation that he reveals who he truly is. If you feel like you are in a season of separation, don't despise it, embrace it. God is working. He is shifting things in your favor. He is preparing you for something greater. The people who left were never meant to stay. The opportunities that closed were never meant to define you. God is leading you to a place you have never been before, and sometimes that journey requires walking alone. Elevation comes with a cost. You cannot stay where you are and expect to go where God is calling you. Sometimes that means walking away from certain relationships. Sometimes that means leaving behind familiar places. Sometimes that means stepping into the unknown with nothing but faith. But the good news is, you are not truly alone. God is with you every step of the way. He is guiding you, covering you, and preparing you for something far greater than you can imagine. So, don't fear the separation. Don't fight what God is doing. Trust him. What feels like a loss is actually a gain. What feels like a setback is actually a setup. Your season of isolation is temporary, but the elevation God is bringing is eternal. Stay faithful. Keep walking. Your time is coming. You are set apart, not left out. The world may look at you and say you don't belong. You may walk into rooms and feel like an outsider. You may watch others form friendships, build relationships, and walk together while you feel like you're standing alone. But let me tell you something. God did not create you to fit in. He created you to stand out. What looks like exclusion is actually distinction. What feels like rejection is actually God's selection. He has marked you for something greater, and when God sets you apart, no one can diminish what he has placed inside you. Many people in the Bible walked alone, not because they weren't worthy of companionship, but because their assignment required separation. Noah was mocked for building an ark when no one had ever seen rain. He stood alone in obedience while the rest of the world continued in wickedness. But when the storm came, the very thing he built in isolation became the place of salvation. Sometimes God calls you to build when others can't see the vision. Sometimes he tells you to move in a direction that doesn't make sense to those around you. And in those moments you will be misunderstood. You will feel different. You may feel left out. But God is setting you apart because he has chosen you for something they can't see yet. David was set apart long before he was crowned king. When the prophet Samuel came to anoint the next king of Israel, David wasn't even in the lineup. His own father didn't consider him. His brothers stood before Samuel looking like kings, but God rejected them. Why? Because God doesn't choose based on what people see. He chooses based on the heart. David was out in the fields, unseen, unnoticed, and uninvited, but he was exactly where God needed him to be. Some of you feel like you are stuck in the background while others are being chosen, promoted, and elevated. You wonder if God has forgotten you, but just like David, your time is coming. You were never overlooked. God has been preparing you in private for something greater in public. He has been developing your character, strengthening your faith, and refining your heart. When the time is right, he will call you forward, and no one will be able to stop the anointing he has placed on you. Being set apart doesn't always feel like a blessing in the moment. It can feel lonely. It can feel like you're being left behind. But let me remind you, Jesus himself was set apart. He walked with the disciples, but even among them there were moments when he had to separate himself. He went to the mountains alone to pray. He withdrew from the crowds to be in the presence of his Father, and when it came time for the cross, he stood alone. The same people who once followed him, praised him, and shouted his name were the same ones who rejected him. Yet even in that moment, he was fulfilling the greatest purpose ever known to mankind. His isolation was not an accident, it was part of the plan. Maybe you have been wondering why you don't fit in. Maybe you've tried to blend in with the crowd only to feel like an outsider. Maybe you've felt the sting of rejection and questioned if something was wrong with you. But hear me today, there is nothing wrong with you. There is something different about you, and that difference is divine. The world celebrates those who conform, but God calls those who are willing to be different. The world rewards those who follow trends, but God anoints those who are willing to break patterns. When He sets you apart, it means He has placed something inside of you that cannot be mixed with the world. It means your calling is too great to be diluted. It means your purpose is too big to be compromised. Look at Esther. She was taken from her people, placed in a palace, and set apart for a purpose greater than she could have imagined. She wasn't just there to enjoy the luxury, she was positioned there to save her nation. Some of you have been placed in environments where you feel like you don't belong. You wonder why God put you in a family that doesn't understand you, in a job that feels uncomfortable, in a city where you feel like a stranger. But what if God placed you there not to fit in, but to shift the atmosphere? What if you are there because you are the one called to bring change? Esther didn't realize the full weight of her calling until the time came for her to act. And when the moment arrived, she stepped into it with boldness. God has not called you to be ordinary. He has not called you to settle. He has set you apart because He has placed something inside of you that is meant to impact the world. And sometimes that means walking alone for a season. Sometimes that means standing firm when others compromise. Sometimes that means saying no when the world pressures you to say yes. It is not easy, but it is worth it. Because when God sets you apart, He also sustains you. He strengthens you. He covers you. You may feel like you are being left out now, but when the time comes, people will see why God had to separate you. They will see why you couldn't walk the same path as everyone else. They will see why you had to go through seasons of loneliness and refinement. And when that moment comes, they won't be able to deny that the hand of God has been on your life all along. Stay faithful, stay obedient, keep trusting. You are not left out, you are set apart. God is your best friend. There is no one closer, no one more faithful, no one who understands you more than He does. People will come and go. Some will promise to be there forever, only to walk away when the road gets rough. Some will misunderstand you, betray you, or forget you, but God remains. He is the one constant in a world that is always changing. He is the one presence that never leaves, the one voice that never stops speaking, the one love that never fails. There are times in life when you feel alone, like no one truly sees you or understands what you are going through. You try to explain your pain, but words fail. You try to open your heart, but people don't seem to listen. You feel like you are carrying a weight that no one else notices. But even in those moments, God sees you. He knows every thought before you think it, every tear before you cry it, every struggle before you speak it. He is not distant, He is near. He is not a God who watches from afar. He is a God who walks beside you. From the moment you were formed, He has been with you. Before you took your first breath, He knew you. Before you spoke your first word, He called you by name. He has been guiding you, protecting you, covering you, even when you didn't realize it. There were moments when you should have fallen, but He held you up. Moments when you should have broken, but He restored you. Moments when you should have lost everything, but His grace carried you through. God is not like people. He does not love you based on conditions. He does not change His mind about you. He does not walk away when you fail. He does not grow tired of your struggles. People may give up on you, but He never will. He is patient, kind, and merciful. He knows your weaknesses and still chooses you. He sees your failures and still loves you. He hears your doubts and still calls you His own. There is nothing you can do to make Him stop loving you. His love is not earned, it is given freely. When you feel lost, He is the one who guides you. When you are afraid, He is the one who calms you. When you are weary, He is the one who strengthens you. There is no problem too big for Him, no burden too heavy for Him, no situation too hopeless for Him. He is the friend who listens when no one else does, the one who stays when everyone else leaves, the one who fights for you when you have no strength left to fight for yourself. In the moments when you feel unworthy, He reminds you of who you are. In the moments when you feel forgotten, He calls you chosen. In the moments when you feel unloved, He wraps you in His presence and fills you with His peace. The world may try to define you by your mistakes, but God defines you by His grace. The enemy may try to convince you that you are alone, but God's word declares that He will never leave you nor forsake you. Life will test you. There will be days when the weight of it all feels unbearable. There will be moments when you wonder if anyone truly cares. But in those moments, remember this: God is right there with you. He is closer than your breath, closer than your thoughts, closer than your fears. You do not have to walk this life alone. You do not have to carry the burden by yourself. You have a friend who is stronger than any storm, greater than any enemy, and more faithful than any human could ever be. He is with you in the silence. He is with you in the chaos. He is with you when you are celebrating, and He is with you when you are breaking. He does not love you more on your good days and less on your bad days. His love is unwavering, unconditional, unshakable. He does not turn His back on you when you fall. Instead, He reaches down, lifts you up, and walks with you until you are steady again. Maybe you have been searching for a friend who will never fail you. Maybe you have been looking for someone who will understand the depths of your heart. Maybe you have been longing for a love that will never fade. Look no further. God has been with you all along. He has been waiting for you to recognize that He is enough, that His presence is enough, that His friendship is the only one that will truly satisfy. The world will tell you that you need approval from people, that you need validation from others. But when you have God as your best friend, you don't need the approval of man. You don't need to chase after love that is temporary. You don't need to seek validation from those who don't see your worth, because the one who created you already calls you loved. The one who formed you already calls you valuable. The one who walks with you already calls you His. So walk with confidence. Not because of who you are, but because of who walks with you. Speak with boldness, not because of your own strength, but because of the power of the one who stands beside you. Live with peace, not because life is always easy, but because you know that you are never alone. God is your best friend. He always has been, He always will be. Walk in your calling with boldness. God did not create you to live in fear, to shrink back, or to hesitate when He has called you forward. He placed something inside of you that is meant to impact the world, something uniquely crafted by His hands, something that no one else can fulfill in the way you can. But the enemy wants to keep you small. He wants to fill you with doubt, insecurity, and hesitation, because he knows that when you fully step into what God has called you to do, you become unstoppable. The greatest attack against your life is not against your comfort, it is against your calling. There is a reason you have faced so much opposition. There is a reason you have battled through seasons of struggle. There is a reason you have felt resistance every time you tried to step forward. The enemy does not fight people who are doing nothing. He fights those who are a threat. And the fact that you have been under attack is proof that you carry something powerful inside of you. The fact that fear tries to hold you back is evidence that God has something great for you on the other side of that fear. Fear is a liar. It will tell you that you are not ready. It will tell you that you are not capable. It will tell you that someone else could do it better. But fear is not from God. God has not given you a spirit of fear, but of power, love, and a sound mind. Moses felt unqualified when God called him to lead the Israelites. He looked at his own weaknesses instead of looking at the power of the one who called him. He told God, "I am not eloquent, I am slow of speech." He tried to convince God that he wasn't the right person for the job, but God's response was clear. "Who made your mouth? Who gives you the ability to speak? God was reminding Moses that his calling was not about his ability, but about God's power working through him. Some of you have been telling God all the reasons why you are not ready, why you are not good enough, why you don't have what it takes. But God is saying, who called you? Who anointed you? Who gave you this assignment? If God called you, then He will equip you. If He gave you the vision, then He will make the provision. He does not choose based on ability, He chooses based on obedience. He is not looking for perfection, He is looking for a willing heart. David was just a shepherd when God anointed him to be king. He was overlooked by his own family, but not by God. When the time came for him to step into his calling, he did not hesitate. He faced Goliath with confidence, not because he trusted in his own strength, but because he trusted in the Lord. He knew that the same God who had helped him defeat lions and bears in private would give him victory in public. That is how you must walk in your calling, with confidence in the one who has already given you the victory. The same God who prepared you in the secret place will establish you in the right place. The same God who has been with you in the small battles will give you victory in the big ones. The enemy will try to make you question yourself. He will try to remind you of your past, your failures, your weaknesses. But God does not call the perfect. He perfects the called. Look at Paul. He once persecuted Christians, yet God called him to be one of the greatest preachers of the gospel. Look at Peter. He denied Jesus 3 times, yet God still used him to build his church. Your past does not disqualify you. Your weaknesses do not cancel your calling. When God chooses you, no one can unchoose you. When God appoints you, no one can remove you. Walking in your calling requires faith. It requires stepping out, even when you don't have all the answers. It requires trusting God, even when the path is unclear. Abraham was called to leave his homeland and go to a place that God would show him, and he obeyed without knowing exactly where he was going. That is the kind of boldness God is calling you to. Faith that moves before the full picture is revealed. Faith that trusts even when the journey feels uncertain. There will be people who don't understand your calling. There will be those who doubt you, who criticize you, who question why you are doing what you are doing. But you do not need their approval. You do not need validation from man when you have a calling from God. If Noah had listened to the opinions of others, he would have never built the ark. If Esther had been afraid of what people thought, she would have never stepped forward to save her people. If Jesus had sought the approval of man, he would have never gone to the cross. The voices of doubt and opposition will come, but they cannot stop you unless you let them. God is calling you to rise up, to stop playing small, to stop allowing fear to dictate your steps, to stop waiting for the perfect moment and start moving in faith. Boldness is not about having no fear. It is about trusting God even when fear tries to creep in. It is about taking that first step even when you don't see the whole staircase. It is about believing that God's power is greater than your insecurities. This is your time. You were not born by accident. You were not placed here without purpose. God has positioned you for something significant, and the world is waiting for what He has placed inside of you. There are lives connected to your obedience. There are people who need what you carry. Your calling is not just about you. It is about the impact God wants to make through you. The longer you hesitate, the longer someone else waits for what God has called you to do. So walk in your calling with boldness. Speak when God tells you to speak. Move when He tells you to move. Trust that He will equip you as you go. You do not have to have it all figured out. You just have to be willing. God has already gone before you. The door is already open. The way has already been prepared. Now it's time to step into it.